Hello. So we got a couple of people in here. How y'all doing this morning? Anyone have any questions first thing this morning? Or anything you want to be reiterated or anything you want to go over?
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is Latonia. So I'm still trying to visualize can you just kind of outline the process from building your component, your React app, and then logistically connecting that to your pre-existing HTML. Just as a background, what I plan to do is my main creative body. So those are images paired with video in like a grid. I may use Flex, but in a grid. But at any rate, I want to use React for that part of it. And I'm just wondering, like, once I have it all done, how do I get that into my my file?
Into the HTML. Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Let me pull up. Oh, all my VS codes are closed. 1 second. Let's do this. I'll create a code sandbox repo just to demonstrate that. And then we'll go over, we'll go over that. That's a good question.
Is that something we'll be able to fork? I mean, we'll have the video, but okay, thanks.
Yeah, I'll share the link in the Slack chat as well. And once I get this up and going, I'll share my screen. I finally got the browser showing the right side of my VS or my code sandbox. Don't know how I did it. I just closed the browser and reopened it, and then there you go, it was there. So no. All right, so share this. And this up. Okay, so, and for anyone just joining, the question was, how do you take a React component or even just a mini React application, and how do you get that into your HTML in a specific place, right? So you only want to use React for like one thing on your page. How do you get that in there? So that's what we're going to go over. So I am going to use this code sandbox repo, which I will eventually share the link to, so you can fork it and take a look. Let me just give it a name. We'll say place React component anywhere in HTML. Save that as public. Okay, and I'm going to change the default HTML that's here, right? So right now there's just this root div. We're going to get rid of that, so we don't see anything. In fact, it just closed my file. Hold on. I'm going to get rid of this, and we're going to just put some filler HTML in here. So we'll just say something like, here's our H1. This cool site. And then we'll do like Oh, this is a great resource, actually. I'll share here. Lorem ipsum. So if you want to just get just a bunch of random nonsense, this is a great site to go to, just lipsum.com. And then just generate some stuff. Right, so I could just place all this here. Just grab a whole bunch. And we'll place that here. I have to refresh this because that app is not tied into it yet. Oops, it helps if I do this. Oh, I see what I did. Whoops, pasted in the wrong spot. There we go. So now we have this stuff, right? So let's say right below this header, but before all this text, we want to place some React component, right? Maybe it's a gallery, maybe it's something else. It's taking a while to refresh. What the heck happened here? There we go. Cool. All right, so what we do is let's start creating a component. We're gonna do something other than app. Let's do, not really. We'll create, I don't know, let's create a subtitle. It doesn't really matter what it is, right? So we'll say subtitle, JS, export const subtitle equals this, and then we'll return some markup. We'll do an H3 or something. So this is my React subtitle. All right, so now we've got just this basic component. This could be a whole range of different things, right? So how do we get that into the HTML? Well, if you remember back on your root of your application, React DOM.render, that's the thing that tells React, say, okay, I see you have this application. Where do you want me to render this thing, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this. I'm going to start over. So all we have right now is just, in fact, we'll get rid of app too, because we don't want that. We just have these two things here. In fact, we can get rid of strict mode. That's just for like really extensive React warnings and commentary in your console as you're developing. It tells you like, hey, you really should do this sort of thing. Like you really should put a key on all of the elements that you're iterating over and creating an array out of. So
and Joey, can I just jump in with a quick question? Yep. And so the stuff that you're deleting is stuff we can delete also. We won't need it for the same reasons that you don't need it now.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so we're just like, you just have an index.js file, you're starting from scratch, like you just want to get some React components somewhere in your HTML. You definitely need to import React DOM because that's the mechanism that allows your components to be rendered into DOM elements and placed into the DOM. So we definitely need that. We're also going to need our React application or just our React component. So we're going to import subtitle from our subtitle.js file. Now we also need a reference to, so we'll say place or elements in DOM to render our component, right? This is a really component. Like this name is really explicit, right? I just want to make sure this is really clear what this is doing. And that's going to equal, well, we got to, where do we place it? Well, we have complete control over where we want this placed. So I could say, well, I want it between my H1 and my P tag. So I'm going to say, I'm going to place a div, give it an ID, and we'll just say subtitle React, whatever. div. Okay, cool. So now I have something that is selectable in the DOM. I'm going to save that. It's going to complain because, oh, I didn't finish the thing here. Then we'll say document, oops, dot get element by ID. Which ID do we want to grab? Well, we want to grab something that says subtitle dash React. That's the ID of the div I want to render my thing inside of. What's this? More real estate here. So now that I know where to place it, I just need to tell React DOM what to do. So I say React DOM dot render, and the first thing I give it is the thing I want to render, which for me is the subtitle component, like as JSX. Like this is how I render. This is how I would render this inside some other component. So I render it the same way here. Then the second argument is I tell it where I want to render it. Well, I want to render it at this thing. Oops, I'm outside. Right? Save that. It's refreshing everything because now React DOM is rendering. And when this comes back up, well, I got to refresh. Sometimes, depending on how busy Code Sandbox is, right here, there's my component. Now, what is also cool is, let's say I want to render a different component underneath all this stuff. Completely separate component that's not even tied to this particular React component at all, right? I want two different React components on my page in different places that are not related, right? They're not part of the same application. They're completely separate. So let's do that. Let's say, let's place this right in the middle of all this p tag mumbo jumbo. So now we've got two paragraph tags. They should separate here in a second, or I have to refresh manually. There we go. Let's say I want to place something in the middle of here, right between these two. We'll say div ID equals, maybe I create a really fancy horizontal rule, right? So I could just say, I could just do this and refresh manually because it's the HTML file. See this gray bar, this horizontal rule? Let's say I have a React component that's a really fancy version of that thing, right? So I would say, okay, well, let me inject my fancy one. And I'll say ID equals fancy HR React, right? I'm gonna create a really cool one because my page it needs really cool horizontal dividers. I don't know. It doesn't really matter what it is. Okay, so let's create another component. Again, completely unrelated. So we'll just call this fancy HR. Yes. Export fancy HR. Render. Is my, oh, see, it even tried to, oh, I didn't want render, I wanted to return, sorry. I wonder why I was doing that. We'll create an HR. We'll do style, just to make it easy so I'm not creating style sheets. And we'll say border is 3px solid blue. Right, whatever, it doesn't matter. So now we can come into our index.js file because that's the start of our application, right? And also the fact that down here, somewhere in here, there is a link to, oh, you know what? Code Sandbox is auto-injecting the script tag every time it renders. That's why I don't see the script tag for our index.js file. But you could literally come down here and just put a script. oops, put a script tag, and your source would be, the path to your index.js file. Code Sandbox is doing that for me automatically. The same way that Create React App auto injects all that stuff automatically for me. Remember, before I injected everything or ejected the solution, it's auto placing all these things for me, right? So that's why we see it render. Well, all you need is literally just a script tag. Let's see. So, okay, so now we have this one here. Before we do that, let's import our other component. So fancy HR from fancy HR. And then we'll create const HR container. And it doesn't really matter what we call it. Document.get element by ID. And this was, what do we call it? We call it this. This is the ID. And now we can say, okay, let's render this other thing. React.render, fancy HR. And then inside our HR container. Save that. Refresh. And there's our other component. So now we have a React component here and a React component here, completely separate. So these two React DOM renders are determining where those things are placed. You could have only one of these, and that is your entire page, right? So the first time you load up a Code Sandbox, the only thing in the body is that, well, besides this little helper thing, the only thing in the body was that div with an ID of root, right? Because Code Sandbox is expecting that this project is going to be a complete React application, right? But you can tell React components where to render anywhere in your HTML. You just have to give it an ID. And then in your script, you use react.render to target that ID and render the thing you want it to render. Does that all make sense? Yep, and you can even do something, let's see. Let's say instead of get element by ID, get element by class name. We'll just say fancy HR. Now what does that look like? Well, again, it's going to target this thing. I could say class equals, remember it's HTML, so it's class, not class name. Even though technically I think it would work, but it would look like this. But you just use class and then fancy HR. So you could target it like that. We render this thing. It's not a DOM element. Oh, let's see. It's not a DOM element. It's not. Well, I've always used ID, so I would just stick to ID. Let's see HR. Oh, get element. Oh, I know why. It was returning an array. That's why I was doing it. It was an array of DOM nodes. There we go. That's better. Yeah, so I would just stick with this, right? Does this all make sense though? Cool. So hopefully it helps you out. Let's see. What else we got in here? Oh, Caitlin's here. Hello.
Hi, sorry, my kid's softball game ran a little later.
Oh, that's no big deal. Okay. Just in case you need this. Let's see. Cool. Yep. So if you only want a React component for drop downs or nav links, yep, it's just you tell it where in the DOM to render. You place those IDs, and then you use React DOM.render with the component, and then the place to render that component. So you can place it anywhere in the DOM. In fact, on when I worked at Raymore with Caitlin, the way the e-commerce site works is, without giving away any details, right? There is the actual application is a CMS, it's a content management system. So you can think of it like WordPress, where all the content and all the images and everything is curated by content authors, right? And they determine through their interface where they want things placed on the page. Well, we don't know, so on the development team, we don't know where they want those things placed right away. So what we do is we put placeholders. You create templates that the content authors could place onto the CMS like editor. It says, okay, I want a main section here. Over here, I want a sidebar, and I want these 3 different types of things to show up. So what we did was we wrote the components to show up in those specific types of containers. And then when the whole application renders, there was a little script that looked at the entire page, returned every single element that had a very specific React ID on it. And it would loop through every single one, read the ID, and that ID gave it the component that said, okay, for this ID, render this component. And they'd go down the page. For this ID, render this one. For this one, render this one. So it was like an automated script that just checks the entire page for any element that has a very specific attribute, and it would render a React component for that attribute, and the whole page would render. Like the entire, I would say 98% of the entire site that you see are all React components. There's still HTML for handling like layout and things like that. But yeah, the entire thing are just tiny little React components all over the page. And they're all tied together through global state, which we kind of went over. So there's like one component, like there's one wrapper component that wraps it all. But everything else renders wherever the content authors decide they want it to render. Because we don't know where, if they change their minds, they want to reorder things, whatever. So all we did was we just had a script that ran through the whole page, looked for anything that looked like it needs to render React, and it rendered it for us. So you can automate that whole process, or you can be very explicit, right? The automation comes from the fact that we don't know where the content authors want to place things, and we don't really care. All we care about is that the components do what they should. But yeah, the script will run through every single element and basically run this command, grab the correct thing from that ID that it was given in the DOM node, and then render it at that DOM node. But you can be very explicit, like just doing a couple things like this too, right? It's the same thing. It's just, we're not looping over anything right now. We're just, hey, render this here, render this here. And it can be different for every page, and so on and so forth. People change their minds a lot. Yes, they do. Sometimes mid-sprint, or twice a sprint. Okay, cool, great. That was a great question, though, and I'm glad you brought it up, because it shows the versatility of React. You can have an entire website that's all HTML except for one little component that you really wanted to reactify, right? You could place it there. And the other cool thing is, let's say you have this big website that you've created in HTML, and you're like, a year later, you're like, I really wish I did this in React. You still can. You can convert little pieces at a time, right? And then you can say, well, I'm just going to replace the header with React. So you create a div, say React-header or whatever, React dom.render your header component at that div, boom, that part of the site is now Reactified, right? And then you can move on iteratively over your entire site until it's finally there. So you can implement it in bits and pieces. You can even implement it alongside other front-end frameworks. As long as you have the script tag of your bundled script and a div to place your application in, you're good to go. But yes, great question. Let me share this. I'm going to just go to just the sandbox, not that particular file in the sandbox. And I will place that in the chat. Maybe if Zoom doesn't take over all of my resources. Construction with legs, very much like that. Yeah, a bunch of Lego blocks. So, all right, so that link is in the Student C2 chat channel. And feel free to fork it, play around with it, experiment. Now, given all that, you still need to have some sort of mechanism to bundle up your React code and make it into something that the browser is going to understand. The browser doesn't understand JSX, right? It doesn't understand that. So you still need like, you could even just do like a create React app where the only thing it exports is just a bunch of different components and then an index file, right? And then just place the divs where you want them. Cool. What? Any other questions you guys got this morning? I'll put this in the resources from Google Classroom too. That's handy. Man, everything's slower on Zoom. Okay. So that resource is out there as well. Cool. All right. What else you guys got? Is the incorporation of or migration to React replace Sass? No, you can still use your existing styles. So if you have CSS or Sass already implemented in your project and you have very specific classes, just use those classes in your React components and you're good to go. Can you have both? You can. Typically, you would only see a project that has both if it's being converted from one to the other, and there's like a kind of like a middle ground. But I would advise sticking with one or the other. Otherwise, it gets a little confusing. If you are going to choose between CSS or Sass, I would say this is going to be one of those things where you're going to hate what I say, but it all depends. and how complex you want to be with it. If you really want to take advantage of reusability and additional functionality and things like that in your CSS, then go with Sass. Right, just stick with that, because at the end of the day, it gets exported as CSS anyways. So, and it's a lot more powerful. You can create variables that hold values that you can reuse. You don't have to type the classes out over and over and over again. There's things called mix-ins where you can have additional functionality, kind of like tiny little functions sort of thing. You can nest things logically, and it creates the CSS selectors for you. Nesting is far better with Sass.
Sass really makes it more efficient for you to type CSS is really what it is. Kind of like React makes things reusable and more efficient. Sass kind of does something similar with CSS, I feel like.
Yeah, and if we take, let me just create, so let's say, let's go to subtitle. We'll create a more complex subtitle here. Slightly more complex. Not terribly so. Let's do stuff like this. Not this in a multi-line. Right, so let's say I have class name equals subtitle. And I have class name equals subtitle text, right? So this is my component. This is my text. Let's say I need to create two different classes because I want a specific style for the overall component. Maybe I want a border, but for the text itself, I want to change the color. I don't really want to change anything else about the other part of the component. So let me go to styles. This is how you would do this in CSS. You'd say, okay, well, I have my subtitle, right? And I'd say border, whatever it's going to be. Let's say 1px solid gray. That's like my favorite border in the world. I don't know. I always do solid grays. And then I also need to do this one as well, right? So I've got subtitle text. Well, in CSS, you do it like this, subtitle, and then I want to target that one specifically as make sure it's within the other one, right? So I'd do that, and then I'd say this, and then I'd say like color, I don't know, green, right? Refresh this. Oh, because I'm not. Oh, that's right, as I don't have the styles applied. Oops. Right, so I took my generic app component out. So I'm going to import from styles.css and give that in quotes. All right, so I applied those two styles, right? Well, in CSS, to nest styles like that, you have to write the first one, write the second one out, which is like, you know, the nested version. All right, so it's very verbose, right? You have to completely write out every single thing. What if there's a third one in here? Gotta write another one, right? So instead with Sass, this could have been done like this. So subtitle, now this is gonna not compile right because this is not a Sass file, but I'd say subtitle, like this, grab that. I'd say, oh, and by the way, because subtitle exists in both places, all I really need is this part to append for the nested portion. That's all I need to do for that. Now, of course, my syntax highlighting is gone because this isn't a Sass file. But look how much simpler it is and how much typing I saved. And it's logical. It's right. Hey, say this class called subtitle will have this style. And any class that starts with subtitle and has this appended to it will get this style, right? Because it's the same text, subtitle, but just this one, not only is it nested inside, but it also has a different class name altogether. So all I have to do is say, hey, yeah, this thing exists inside of it, and append this to the CSS selector so I could select that properly. But yeah, that's the nesting's far better with Sass. You don't have to write as much. You just logically nest these things together. And what's more is, let's say I have a hover state. We'll say when I hover, I want it to be red, right? Well, guess what? I have to write all these things out, right? Instead, down here, I can just say, hey, oh, by the way, the text, yeah, we're gonna also put a hover on that, and that's gonna be color red. Completely nested within each other logically. Right, so once you get used to that sort of structure, it makes sense, and you don't really want to go back to regular CSS anymore. And Sass isn't the only thing that does this. There's also a pre-compiler called Less, L-E-S-S, which is it solves the same problem that Sass is solving. It's just the syntax is just a little bit different for like variables and things, but you can nest the same way. They're both really popular, so choose the one that resonates better with you. If you like the syntax of one over the other, yada yada. So at Raymore, we used Sass. At my new company that I'm working at now, we use Less. It's basically the same thing, just a couple syntactic differences for creating variables and mixins and things like that. There, I'll leave that in the file, so it's there. What a terrible, terrible UI, right? This looks like GeoCities when that first was around. If anyone has heard of GeoCities before? No? Oh man, I feel really old now. Okay, so let's see. Bootstrap uses both CSS and Sass. Bootstrap is written in Sass, but they export a CSS library that you can just tag, right? Because you can't just put a link tag in your HTML and target a Sass file. It doesn't work because the browser doesn't know what that is. The browser only knows CSS, HTML, and some parts of JavaScript, not all JavaScript. Some of that needs to be compiled, like React's version of JavaScript, like with JSX, has to be compiled. So the browser only knows just CSS. So these CSS preprocessors like Sass and Less have to be compiled down, where you could import Bootstrap Sass into your project and use it with your Sass files, but you still have to bundle it down in CSS in your project. Whereas they also offer the already converted or already pre-compiled CSS file to just link into any project. But they write everything in Sass. It's just you can import their stuff directly or they're exported CSS. If you're using Bootstrap, you also need a Sass file, not if you're using their CSS files. Only if you're using their Sass files, then you need Sass in your project. Otherwise, it won't compile at all. Good questions. Good questions. Let's see. Anything else on people's minds?
I have another question. This is Latonia, if no one else is waiting right now.
There's one more question. If you use inline Sass, do you need to use the special? That's for. Oh, you mean like the ampersand? No, you could. Maybe you can unmute and explain it.
If you look in some of the Bootstrap examples, when they show you Sass code, there's the $. Is that only in your file, or do you do that if you're doing it in line, or don't you do Sass?
No, those are variables. pretty sure those are variables in SAS.
Okay.
So it's
Yeah,
like
that's
dollar
good.
sign the name
Colors.
and then some value. That's like the same thing as creating a variable in JavaScript.
A const or a let or a,
Yeah, exactly.
oh, okay.
So
So-
SAS allows you to create variables and then reuse that value.
Ah, sort of like a class you can reuse.
Yeah, like what Caitlin just posted right
Right.
there.
Right, okay, I gotta read that. I gotta review this stuff, but this all of a sudden it's like it's coming together thanks to you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you would not use that inline because that's a variable declaration.
Okay,
You would use the value of that.
okay, got it. Great, and thanks,
Well, I
Caitlin.
mean, you'd still use it, but you'd use it as like, the value, like, so like color red would be on the right side of the colon of the class selector.
Right,
Color.
yep.
Yep.
And when you do inline CSS, it's not like that. See, I gotta go back and review because I'm getting
I
the two
think-
confused.
I think I'm confused on what you mean by inline CSS.
When you do it in your right in the document. As opposed to.
Oh,
a
it's
file.
like, oh, you're talking about in an HTML file, like style equals, and then the string of styles.
Right, or just like in the body of it, if there's a specific.
Yeah, no,
thing
you'd
you
have to
want to
do-
style,
You'd have to do straight up CSS. You can't use SAS in that
okay,
instance.
all right, but you don't need a separate CSS file, so you're still. Ooh, they all get along eventually, okay.
Yep.
This is very helpful, because all this stuff's kind of going, woo, thank you,
Yeah, no
Very
problem.
thanks for. yes,
Latonia, you had a question too.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so bear with me because I might say this wrong. You showed us an example where I think you created a component, but then you showed us how to use different instances of the same component. Is that making sense?
Yeah, you can basically being able to reuse that component.
Well, you changed something about it. So I thought you termed it different instances under that same component. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. I can find it in the videos. I was hoping you could show another example.
Different instances. So if let's
Like
see.
you gave the same one different values for different instances underneath. I'm sure. I'm saying this wrong.
Different values for the props, you mean?
I felt like it would maybe. I just
Well, I
remember you
think-
saying you can use the same thing, but you can change
Yes.
things about it. Is that ringing a bell?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
thank you.
Yep. Yeah. So let's go over that real quick. But I know what you're talking about. Okay. So let's see. Let's take this subtitle again, right? And I'm going to create another smaller component that can take a prop and display different values. So we'll create a component. We'll just call this generic text. It's just a text component. So export text equals. We're going to render, or sorry, we're going to render some markup. We'll just say, it's just, we'll do a p tag. And we're going to render props.text, right? So this is the props object. This is the prop it takes, which is props.text, and that's where it's going to render it. Now I can come into subtitle. I can import that thing, right? Import text. Text. Oops. Now I can render different instances of that component. I could say, okay, this is my React subtitle. So I can come in here. In fact, I'm not going to do it right there. I'm going to do it right below. I'm going to say text. Right now, it's not rendering anything yet because I still need to give it that prop. And I can say text equals, I don't know, more text. So there's this one. I can do a different instance of that, give it a different value. Same component, rendering different values because I gave it different values to render. Is that what you were thinking? Yeah. And I can even do things
and I guess I'm still confused. So like how do you keep track of which is which? Because they're named the same, even though they have a different value.
Yes. So the way you keep track of it is where you is right here. So this one should say this. This one should say this. The reusability is the fact that I have this component that accepts text as a prop, and all it does is render what it's given. I can reuse that anywhere. I guess what would make this even maybe a little clearer is if I give it another prop. And let's just say I give it a class name prop. I'll give this one the class name of blue text. This one, the class name of red text. I'll create some styles real quick. Blue text, color blue, same thing except red, right? So now I have these two styles. I pass in this prop and this prop to this instance. And I pass this one and this one to this instance. So now if I accept a class name as a prop, oops, helps if I spell it right. Okay. So the text component itself, let me split screen this. The text component itself is the reusable thing. So the way I reuse it is by literally just placing another one of those into my markup, right? So I can have a bunch of these things. For each one, I can tell it to render something different.
Can
And the
I
way
ask a question related to this?
Yeah.
So, because I wanted to do I was thinking about using React, and my project is like these festivals. So I wanted to do cards. So now I'm thinking like a component with reusability would be perfect because each thing is just, it's all the same. It's going to be where and blah, blah, blah.
Right. It's styled the same, right? It's constructed the same, but the data is different.
The data is different. So would I be in here like how you have the text? Would all my info though, like be within that rendering?
You would pass all your info in as props.
Okay.
Let's
I wouldn't do it
and this
this
will
way?
actually help. This actually is great because I'll create a small product card. We'll make it reusable, and that'll also help illustrate the reusability of Latanya's question. Like, how do you keep track of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So let's do this. Let's take, let's leave those there for now. And then let's create a really simplistic product card. We'll just call it card.js. And so we have our, the class name, card, and then we'll have, I don't know, this will be like the name of the card, the name of the item, right? So let's say props.name, and then I could say, oops, we'll have a description, props.description, right? And then we'll do description. We'll throw these together real quick, just so we have something, right? So we've got a card, which has orange. I don't know, just something. Okay, sure. And then we have card name. Just to throw something in there. Card description. I type that fast today. I don't know, font size, really small. So we've got this stuff, right? And we go to subtitle. We're going to render it inside of subtitle for whatever reason. In fact, we'll just comment those out so we don't see it. So let's import that thing. So I'm going to import card, card. All right, so now let's create two cards. Card from, oh, sorry. We can see these, there's two cards here. This orange blocky stuff. In fact, let's make it, we'll say, right, yes, with yes, margin, just to give it some, there we go. So we got a couple different cards here. And now for each card, oops, split this out so you can see it. For each card, we can render different data. So this is data that's going to come from probably your API, which comes from your database, right? So there's a event, right? These are events or something, right? So whatever event this is, it's got a name. So you would iterate over, like you'd map through it and things like that. And you'd say name equals, well, this is like, I don't know, this is a concert. The description is, I don't know, Van Halen or something, right? So now you've got a card with this data. Well, this component, it's just another one of these components, but we're just telling it to render something different. So this is maybe play, let's say Phantom. Right, so now we've got this card and this card completely, they're the same component. The only thing different is the data I'm passing in. So that's the reusability of it. And that's the power of these components and their, basically the reusability. Does that help you? Explain? Does it help both of you? Yep. And so the way to, the way we quote unquote keep track of this is literally where we are calling this thing, right? So we're instantiating this here. We're instantiating another one of them here, but we're telling it, well, this one is for this and this one's for this.
And then what's populating it within each card, there would be like the API call if I'm storing the info somewhere.
Yeah, so let's do this. Let's go one step further and let's pretend that from API. Let's just pretend this is our data. We made a call, right? I'm not going to set up a whole API. But we've got, it's a name. You know, we have our concert. Description. Your favorite band. And then we've got another one. Right, so we've got a bunch of stuff. Now we can do this. We can say, okay, we got our stuff from our API. We're holding it in state, like in our use state, like we got it back, we store it in use state. Now we can map over that. We could say, okay, so we're going to take our data from API, whatever it happens to be. In fact, let's make this, let's call it this, events. That way the naming makes sense in relation to the data, and then we map over it. And for each one of these, we're going to return a card for every single one of these. Well, we get our event. Let's give it an ID. Because if it's in your database, it's going to have a unique ID anyways. Now we can say, okay, cool. So we'll give our key our event.id, right? Because that's our unique value. I've got two cards rendering again. Then the name for each card is going to be whatever the event.name is, right? So event.name, here's our name. And then for each one of these, the description is equal to event.description. So there, I took a bunch of data that I got back from my API. I'm going to map over it, and I'm going to return one of these cards. And for each card, this is the data for this is the data for this, and that's for that. Does that make sense? Super cool, absolutely. It's like, it's pretty powerful. And you can even go so far as to like do other things. Like you don't just have to return this. You can like return like a structure. So let's take it one step further, even more. We could say like, this is a card wrapper, and this is border APX double black. And we'll do padding of, I don't know, right? So we've got some sort of card wrapper thing. There's an additional style maybe I want to put around like each card. And I can come in here and I could say, okay, I'm gonna wrap each one of these in a div, right? So now I'm creating a structure. I'm not just the component, but now it's like a component tree in and of itself. Now for each one of those, it gets that, right? So I can do other things. I can say, okay, this, right? So now this whole thing, now of course, this is irrelevant now. You got to put this at the top level. That's another thing you got to be careful of. Your key always goes on the top level thing that you're returning from an array. But here you can see we've got an event, right? So this structure here can be really large. And for every one of these events, I'm rendering this structure for every single one of those things. So you can get pretty fancy with this. It's not just rendering one component. Now, eventually, what you'd want to do if this gets really complex is you'd want to extract this out into its own component and then just import that, right? Instead of, or you could just leave it as the markup if this is the only place in your application that uses it.
So if this was too big, you'd turn it into a constant and it would become a component? Or you would take the whole block of that info and then drop it in?
Yeah, so let's do that.
And I'm also curious about photographs, how you would do photos.
Let's call this card wrapper. And we'll export const card wrapper. That's going to take props. Let's copy that. Now, at this point, you have to think about, well, this is the key doesn't go here anymore. I'll show you why. But now you've got to think, well, where is this stuff coming from? Well, you have to pass that in as a prop now. So that's one step further you have to go. I'll also have to import our card because this file uses it. Right, so now I have this card wrapper thing. Like my structure is getting really large, right? And so I extract it out. Now I can just import card wrapper. And replace that here with card wrapper with the key of the event.d. And then my event prop would be the event itself. Once it compiles, there's rendering the same, but now it's all tucked away in this one component. So all that tree of markup now lives somewhere else. And all I have to do is import this one thing, give it the key, pass the event down into it. Oops. And we're expecting that event as a prop. And now I can just render everything that way. So like I said, you can get pretty fancy with this. Does that help? Does that all make sense?
Yeah, definitely. Now, would you do a photograph as a prop, or how would that be? Or like, would the photograph be in my API? Like, I'm confused about
Yeah,
that.
so for photos, you're not going to actually render the photo. What you're going to do is you're going to use like an image tag and give it a source prop of a URL that references your photo, where that photo lives, right? So I don't have any photos here, and I don't think I can upload any. What I could do is grab a random photo like this one. Let's say that's the URL of my photo. In fact, I think that changes every refresh. So cool. So I have, let's plug that in. Let's go to our card. In fact, wait, before we do that, we'll just say photo, or we'll say image. Image URL, let's make it really explicit. There's the image URL. It's really long, but image URLs usually are. It's going to be a reference to where it lives on your server, basically. Oh, helps if I have the comment in the right place. Okay, so now I have these events. They have their own IDs, their own name, description, a URL that references the image that you want to display for that card. In fact, let's change. I think what we can do is just change the size, which is like 50. Is it 50? If I remember. No, that's not it. Let me grab, I know what I'll do. I'll grab an image off of our project. I'll just go off of mine because it's already here. Fork. Here, module 6. Doesn't matter. Source. Data. Slash. Okay. So we'll do this. Let's say 1, 2, 3. We'll do it. 100. So this should give me a very specific image. Cool. So it gets me that one. And I think that should get me the same thing every time. Yep. So here's this image. We'll just do separate image for that. Right, so now we have images, the URLs for images. So how does that work, right? So in our card, well, we need to accept a prop for the image. Well, this is off the event. But the card itself needs to render an image. So image tag, just like this. Our source, it's going to be props dot, what do we call it? Image URL. Why is this? Oh, okay. Event image. Event. Photo. Doesn't like that. Okay, cool. Event, whatever. All right, so now we have an image tag. It just needs a URL to be able to render that image. So now let's go to our card wrapper. We need to make sure that we are passing that prop along. All right, so image URL equals props.event.image URL. There they are. Doesn't look pretty, but that's how you render images. You give the source attribute the URL of where that image lives on your server, in this case, where it lives out on the internet, someone else's server. And I wouldn't just render anyone's image, so there's copyright stuff with that. So if you have photos that are copyright free and they live in your server, and that's the URL you would put for that. And you'll get into more about, I would ask when it gets to the database in the backend stuff, ask about relative paths to image URLs and what that looks like. What does that URL actually look like? It doesn't look like this, unless pixum.photos is your domain. Instead, it would look something like this, where there's the first part of this URL will be automatically assumed by your server. Like this won't render anything because I don't have anything locally on my server that has this. So that's what I have to render. But this is essentially what you would do. You'd have a relative URL to where this image lives on your server. But ask about that when it comes to the API stuff and the database stuff, and they'll be able to explain that a little bit more in depth.
We've kind of done that already just with importing components, right? I mean, when they're in subfolders, it's kind of the same concept, right?
Yeah, so you just have to make sure that the images you have available to you, they're in a place that's publicly accessible, right? So you can't link to an image that's not in a public accessible URL, right? Otherwise, there's a permission error, right? Does that help? Cool. Then we have our terribly styled events. Excuse me. Yeah. So that's cool. Let me just do this one thing because it's no, that won't work. Doesn't matter. Okay, let's see.
I actually have a question if there aren't any others in the chat. So I've been noticing in various places and different kinds of documentation, the use of classes in the examples and explanations in my own APIs I'm looking at, and then also in the React documentation. So I was trying to kind of get a better understanding. I went back and reviewed the class video where you talked about classes, not necessarily to use them, but just to be able to at least understand the documentation and what they're talking about. And I don't know, I was kind of wondering if you could go over that a little bit, or maybe just like open up the forms documentation, for example, and the React documentation and kind of explain a little bit about like their code that they've got up there. Some of the concepts you didn't go over, like bind and I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm not really understanding. I was trying to read about it, but then the MDNs are really extensive and confusing. So,
so class components, basically, right?
Class components. Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have used the more precise phrasing.
Oh, okay. What did they say?
It's just in the main concepts. I had a.
Was it in main concepts?
Yeah, it's number 9.
Oh, forms. Okay.
That was just one place where I saw the example.
Oh, like right here.
Yeah, that type of stuff.
So they're creating class components. Okay, so in the beginning, just to kind of reiterate what we went over that first day.
Yeah, so actually that was really helpful. When I went back and reviewed that, it clarified a number of these things.
Yeah, so in the beginning, there were 2 different types of components. One, of course, class components that we're looking at right here, and then function components, which is what we've been using. Now, function components were strictly like just for rendering things. They're just like views. They're view components. That was another kind of term that was used, the view component. Like all it does is render stuff. There's no logic. It just, here's some markup, here's some props, render that thing, right? That's what they were used for. If your components did not need logic, that's what you'd use a function component for. Now, originally they called them stateless functional components, right? Or functional stateless components or something like that. Yes. So class components could hold values inside them like pieces of state. They could have that sort of logic. They also have access to like these life cycle methods that we've been talking about. They know when something, we can hook into when this thing renders in the DOM, when it updates, before it leaves the DOM. So class components were like the powerhouse. And that's due to the fact of classes in JavaScript can hold their own values. And what I mean by that is if you have, now, when you create classes, what you're doing is you're calling a function, this class constructor function, that returns to you an instance of that class. It doesn't return the class itself, it returns a copy of that thing. So you can call that function 3 times, and you have 3 separate copies that each have a reference to their own internal state. So the values inside them can be completely different, and they'll all render fine. So that was the reason why class components became a thing, because it just reiterated off of the fact that JavaScript classes can hold, you can instantiate new instances of these things, and they can all hold different prop values, right? Or state values. So that was why class components were there. Now, this whole bind thing, if you have a function, when you call a function, by default, the this argument refers to the thing that's calling that function. But if that function lives inside a class component, and I say, this dot whatever, let's say the bind wasn't there, this, and I'm saving things to state, this wouldn't work, because what's calling that function is not necessarily the component. It might be wherever the user is calling it from, its parent component. Well, its parent component doesn't have this function. So what we had to do was we had to take this, which refers to this instance of this component, and the function within this instance, we have to bind it to itself. So the next time it's called, it refers to this instance of the component, which now has access to that piece of state. Pretty confusing.
Yeah,
But,
it's confusing. I understand the purpose. I'm not sure if I understand. Yeah. I'll just probably listen to that explanation a few times and maybe.
Yeah, so because every instance has access to itself,
okay,
we say this dot whatever. But this dot whatever is not always called by the same thing. It might be something that's called from a parent component, or another particular element, or another part of the application. But what we want to do is to say, every time we say this dot whatever, I want it to mean this instance of the component, not anything else, not the original, whatever. I want this particular instance is calling its own change handler. So we have to bind it to itself so that it knows, hey, when this function's called, the value of this right here is this particular instance of the component, not any others.
So those are all the same this, it's just, yeah.
Yes,
okay.
It's basically the component's way of saying, hey, every time this function's called, right? So if you have three components lined up and the middle one says, hey, this function's being called, oh, it means my version of that internal function, not anyone else's. So you have to bind it to itself so it knows which one, because JavaScript, the value of this can change. And that's a whole confusing topic.
Okay.
So that's what that's for. But as soon as hooks came along, function components can now have access to the same type of state logic and lifecycle logic that class components have. And it's far easier to read and write.
Yeah.
Right. So this got real confusing. And if classes confused you in JavaScript, you're kind of like, well, this is going to be confusing too.
Yeah. We didn't really cover this too much. And yeah, I think I've got, like, in the APIs, I'm going to be using some of the examples were in this type of stuff. And I'm going to kind of try to translate them over to the
Yeah,
way
so
we're
that would
doing
be
it. So what is that super thing?
oh, this just means
I didn't even look into that too much, but
yeah, so it just means the when this thing's being instantiated, this super means it's like the original React.component class. It's a reference to that. So when you're calling this constructor, these props have to be constructed in such a way that the original class knows how to do that. So it's just a reference to the one this one is being extended from. It's again, it's a real confusing topic. It's necessary if you create a class component, and I would leave it at that.
okay, yeah, it's not something I really have to understand in order to understand how the rest of it is working.
Yeah, and I it's been so long since I've used these things that I probably won't be able to articulate it without rereading a couple things first.
Okay. And then that React.component, that's something they've created in their application.
Yeah, so
Inform
React.component,
extends React.component. That's not an actual, it's capital. So it's something they've created, right?
it's something they create. Yeah, it's a class that they created inside their library.
Okay. That
So
was
whenever you
because
see,
it said React, and I was like,
yeah, whenever you see extends, whatever, like this class extends the functionality of this class. It's just, that's a class they wrote.
Okay.
We're just extending the functionality. We're saying, hey, I want access to this functionality, but I'm going to do my own thing.
Okay. Okay.
I would say I would Google like convert class component to function component. There's there's a lot of examples out there, and that'll give you a great insight into what are all these things and how do if I want to use someone else's component because I like it, but I want to change some stuff, and they wrote a class component, how do I convert that to a function component?
It's a good idea. Okay.
And then there's a lot of great resources out there for that. So that's a good kind of key phrase. Convert class component to function component, and then you'll see 28,000 blog articles on it.
Thank you. That's helpful. I was just running into this because I was trying to answer your question on the exercises about well, I had a basic answer from what we've learned in class and everything about why you have to do event.prevent default. But I decided, this is actually submitting. So let's see what happens if I take that out on a form that's actually submitting. And then I got an error message that was talking about controlled and uncontrolled inputs. Yeah. And it brought me here. And I was like, okay, I can't really understand what this is talking about because I don't understand the examples. So
yeah, so controlled and uncontrolled means when they're controlled, and it's highly encouraged that you create controlled components. You control what value is in that element at all times. So you always understand what that is. Versus if it's not controlled, what's the value in your state may not be the same value that's in that element. There's no guarantee depending on the patterns you might be using. So if it's controlled, you say, hey, if I have an input field, right? I'm explicitly saying the value of this input field is whatever's value is being held in state. And I'm controlling that because I'm changing it every time it changes. I'm plugging it into state. It goes back down to the input. They're in sync. So it's always encouraged that you create controlled form elements. There was a question. What are wrappers used for in React, and when should we use them? Wrappers are just like a generic type of term for, like if you have a bunch of HTML elements and you have a div that wraps around them with a specific class attached, that's a wrapper. Like you're placing something else around another thing. In React, they're typically used for, actually, like I just did with, like this is a great example. This card wrapper, all it's doing is it's creating a different, it's adding some style around every single event. So the wrapper itself is just styling. And then here's the component that I'm wrapping around the styling with.
It's kind of like a way to contain something, like a container almost.
Yeah.
Just like Bootstrap.
Well, I didn't want to use container because of that. I didn't want to confuse you, but it's just a
No, but-
way to like contain things in one, like,
Yeah, they have wrappers in Bootstrap, right? Like a nav bar has to be this.
yeah.
So it's the same
Okay.
concept. It's not
Uh-huh.
different. Okay.
Yeah.
So you can think of it like this. So think of, I don't know if you've ever seen a train go down the tracks with these giant containers on them, like they're like truck containers or like truck trailers. Like the contents of those things, think of that as the components, and the wrapper is the container holding them. So all these wrappers, they kind of look the same, but the contents are different. So you're just wrapping something that holds these other things inside of it. It could be for purposes of styling. It could be for purposes of functionality. So you want to wrap each component with a custom hook that grabs stuff automatically from an API or things like that. So it's just something that holds the value of something else. But the holder, that wrapper thing itself, may just have, you know, additional styles or additional logic that you want to ensure exists around the other thing. Let's see, that was. Did I get all the questions in the chat? Looks like Caitlin was answering them. Did I miss anyone else's question? There's one more.
Yeah, when we were talking about for Susan's capstone, the photographs, and you said they're not really rendered.
Well, the photo.
They're downloaded.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Like you're not.
Okay.
Let me put it this way. So if I go to the card, this source doesn't take an actual image. It takes a placeholder where that image exists.
Yes.
So you don't actually pass a file, the image file itself, into here. You pass a URL where it
A
lives, and then
direction
the
to
browser
it.
will download it and display it.
Right. So in a sense, it renders, but not.
Yeah, like
Yeah,
this component's
okay.
not actually rendering your image.
Right. Got
right?
it. Okay. Thank you.
It's just rendering it. It's downloading it and displaying it. In that case, yeah,
I guess
render is probably not the right word, but
Well, I was confusing rendering and displaying because I've often thought of, how something renders on the screen, like from a
Yeah.
user standpoint or something, but I got it. Thank you.
yeah. Oh, did we cover everything else? Any last questions? We're about almost a half hour over. Lost track of time. All right, cool. Well, if there's no other questions, then have a great weekend. I look forward to seeing your homeworks turned in. And yeah, so it's been fun. If you have any specific questions, feel free to reach out. Or if you want to set up one-on-ones in the future, maybe you're just kind of processing everything and you haven't really thought of what you'd want to do on one-on-one for. My schedule's kind of crazy, so I apologize ahead of time for that. But sometimes on the weekends I have like weekend mornings or.
You can breathe a little. Do you have just a couple seconds after this?
I kind of really do have
Very
to go.
quick.
If we want to answer, if you have a question now, we can do it right now.
No, it's not a question. It's different. Okay, we can
Okay.
do private. We'll do private message. That's fine.
Yeah, just hit me up in Slack and I can
Yep.
answer asynchronously.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, have a great weekend, everyone, and good luck on your capstones.